Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the last event in the first webinar series organised by the University of Cambridge Faculty of History. Whilst we're so sorry not to be all together in person for this event, the webinars have allowed alumni from around the world to take part, and on behalf of the University and its Faculty of History, I'd like to give a special welcome to those of you joining us from outside the UK who might not usually have been able to participate. Welcome. I'm Dr. Jessica Gardner, and I'm the Director of the University Libraries of Cambridge. In normal times, I'm based in the glorious University Library building in an office just underneath that 17-foot tower of books you'll remember so well. But we're together today to celebrate the Rising Tide, Women at Cambridge, an exhibition and public programme which was hosted at the University Library over the last academic year and curated by Dr. Lucy Delap and Dr. Ben Griffin of the Faculty of History. As we'll hear from both of them shortly, the Rising Tide marked the long history and struggle for equality by women at Cambridge. The programme included an exhibition, a portrait display, and many events designed and run by people across Cambridge, from students to historians, to activists, to sports club members, to colleges, writers and artists. It felt like a vibrant year-long conversation about history and its impact today. And it's wonderful to extend that celebration with you online now. Every single college from Cambridge contributed, and at its heart was a beautifully researched and curated exhibition by Lucy and Ben from the Faculty of History. Now, although the exhibition is now finished, you can still explore it online via a virtual walkthrough and get a taste of the letters and lives, the protest posters and costumes, the photographs, even rocket and confetti, of which more later, from the archives of colleges of Cambridge and its University Library. Today, Lucy and Ben are going to talk us through their research behind the Rising Tide, told through some of the key objects on display. Lucy Delap is Reader in Modern, British and Gender History at the University of Cambridge. She is also the Deputy Chair of the Cambridge History Faculty and Fellow of Murray Edwards College. She is widely published on the history of feminism, gender, labour and religion. And her next book, Feminisms: A Global History, will be published by Penguin in September this year. Ben Griffin is a university lecturer in modern British history and a Fellow of Girton College. His book, The Politics of Gender in Victorian Britain, Masculinity, Political Culture and the Struggle for Women's Rights, won the Royal Historical Society's 2012 Whitfield Prize for the best first book on British history. He is currently working on a book entitled The Gender Order and the Judicial Imagination in Modern Britain. Now, just before we start our presentation with Lucy and Ben, let me first give you a little bit of housekeeping information for us all as participants. First of all, this session is being recorded and it will be available online in the new website of the Faculty in History. Please also note that your camera and microphone have been disabled through this presentation, but you will be able to interact with us through the Q&A, and we really hope you will. There's a button at the bottom of your screen, and if you click on it, you'll see that a Q&A window will pop up and you'll be able to send your questions. And we'll try to answer as many of them as we can as we come to the close of the discussion. That will be around 13:40 when we'll open the Q&A session to us all. So with no further ado, please let me invite Lucy to start her presentation. Lucy.
Thanks so much, Jessica, and it's really great to be here and to be experimenting with this marvelous new format of Zoom webinars. Super to have so many of you with us, and it's great to be able to revisit the exhibition. I wanted to just open with a few words about the title, Rising Tide. The exhibition was designed to feature and showcase the achievement of the founding of Girton College 150 years previously, so we were very much locked into that wonderful anniversary. But we called it the Rising Tide in tribute to another anniversary that happened last year when the exhibition opened, which was 25 years since the publication of a report chaired and written by Nancy Lane Perham, a zoologist at Girton, commissioned by John Major, which was looking at women in STEM subjects. And she called her report The Rising Tide, and it was hugely instrumental in spurring measures to encourage women into STEM subjects and keep them in there, such as the Athena project and WSETI that some of you may remember from your time in Cambridge. So we wanted to honour Nancy Lane Perham's report, but we also felt that the idea of the rising tide captured very nicely something of the feelings of men at Cambridge University when faced with the prospect of the incorporation of women. It was that sense of the kind of stifling anticipation of women's presence in these formerly all-male environments. One of the early critics of the women's colleges described the prospect of women studying as, like, he called it, a serpent that is gnawing at our vitals. And that gives us something of the kind of the mindset of why Cambridge, which has this incredible honour of having been the first UK institution to admit women to a residential degree, with the founding of Girton College in 1869, was also the last to admit them to full degrees. So women were studying without being able to put BA after their name, as we'll hear about in this presentation. And that rising tide metaphor, that sense of kind of drowning or stifling, came up again, and I think this is captured nicely in a quote from Geoffrey Keynes, who was a very eminent Cambridge surgeon and bibliophile, very significant figure in Cambridge. And he wrote in the 1960s in a commentary on William Blake about what he called the evil of female domination, so destructive of the male personality. And again, that much later quote helps us get at that sense of why Cambridge men were so resistant to the presence of women. The tide metaphor captures that sense of the repeated battles. There wasn't just one battle to be fought, but really every step for inclusion and equity of access required a struggle. So it was the tide coming in and going out and coming in and going out. And I would say that that tide is still coming in and going out. We're still fighting various battles around gender issues and gender justice in Cambridge. So I'm going to pass over to Ben now to say a little bit more about the history of the university, and then I'll come back to talk about some of the items in the exhibition.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. Lucy has already explained some of the intentions behind the exhibition. We wanted to treat the history of women at Cambridge not as a supplement to the history of the university, but to place women's history at the heart of the history of the university. And that allowed us to explore some of the really quite dramatic changes that have taken place in the history of Cambridge University over the last 150 years. Our story is one of quite extraordinary change. If you think back to 1850, the only subjects that a Cambridge student could study for an honours degree were maths and classics. The history tripos wasn't introduced until 1875, and indeed there are subjects like geography that have just celebrated their centenary. Most students didn't study for honours degrees at all. The majority of Cambridge students took an ordinary degree, not an honours degree, and they probably weren't taught by university lecturers or professors. In the 1850s, most teaching was provided by privately hired coaches rather than university lecturers. And the university was overwhelmingly an Anglican institution. Until 1856, in order to graduate, you had to be a member of the Church of England. The majority of Cambridge graduates went on into careers in the churches, and you had to be in holy orders to be a fellow most of the time in the Cambridge colleges. So to get from there to where the university is today, a modern research-led university, involved Cambridge reimagining what it meant to be a university, what it was to be a student, what a Cambridge college was for. And in the course of those transformations, we wanted in the exhibition to show how women had shaped the outcome of those battles and how women had been implicated at every stage in the creation of this modern university. So this is a story about how patterns of inclusion and exclusion were continually being redrawn as the university reimagined and remade itself. And we wanted very much to pay tribute to the creativity of the women of Cambridge in navigating this constantly shifting landscape. So to that end, we'd like to show you some of the exhibits from the exhibition, some of the ones that we thought were particularly interesting. And Lucy's going to start us off, and she's going to begin, I think, by telling us about an extraordinary 18th century portrait.
Thanks, Ben. So you should be able to see on the next slide, there's two portraits here, in fact. There's the 18th century one, which should be on the left of your screen, and a 20th century portrait. They're both women who worked for Cambridge colleges. And we're starting with this because we wanted our exhibition, The Rising Tide, to be not just about students and academics within the university, but to recognise the much longer history of women who were performing all sorts of labour within the Collegiate University. Women did not arrive on the scene when Girton was founded because they had long been there, scrubbing the floors, cleaning the sheets, and generally keeping life in the colleges going. The portrait on the left is one that we found when we went to Magdalen College and we asked them about the history of these labouring women. As you can imagine, labouring women, working class women, often didn't leave many traces in the archive. So we were very keen to try to find what we could, but we were aware that we might not find very much. The Magdalen archivist was really excited by our interest in this topic and mentioned that there was an unknown woman whose portrait was hanging in the Porter's Lodge and who had been the college laundress in the 18th century. So that's the portrait you can see on your screen. Sorry, it's not a great image, but hopefully you can get a sense of it. When we went to have a look at the portrait, we took it down. It was absolutely filthy. You know, it hadn't been taken from the wall for many years, obviously. And we were really thrilled when we turned it over and discovered that in 4 places on the back, this laundress's name had been written, Elizabeth Briggs. So even though the college archivist had lost track of who she was, and there are no other facts about her life that we know, fortunately, because of someone's foresight in taking note of her name, she's one of the very few 18th century working class women who has a named portrait. And she's there really to recognise that much longer history of women working in the colleges. And then I just slipped in on the right the picture of the old lady in the van, who is the indomitable Christabel Proctor, who was head gardener at Girton College from 1933 and who absolutely transformed the gardens there. And there aren't very many pictures of her in her working life. I think she was quite reluctant to pose for the camera. She was profoundly deaf, and she managed her whole working life by lip reading. So she's a pretty extraordinary figure in a number of dimensions. And she's a reminder of how important women were to gardening and still are today, and how significant that kind of work has been to the development of the colleges. So there's 2 wonderful figures for you. We can talk more about any of these aspects in the Q&A, but because we're keen to cover a lot of ground, I'm going to turn over now to Ben again, who's going to take us on to some of the women's college histories.
Right, well, this is a letter from Emily Davies, not Emily Davidson, which it says on the PowerPoint. I don't know how that happened, forgive me. It's from Emily Davies, the founder of Girton, my college. And as Lucy's already said, Girton was the first institution in the country to offer women the same residential higher education that had previously only been available to men. And it's important to recognise what a bold step the creation of Girton was. It involved reimagining what a college at Oxford or Cambridge could be. I mean, you can see that in the architecture. The women's colleges are laid out very differently, long corridors rather than open courtyards and staircases. And it's no coincidence that the creation of the women's colleges coincided with a period when the university was rethinking its curriculum, the modes of teaching, and its institutional forms. Many of the men who supported the creation of the women's colleges, men like Henry Sidgwick, wanted to change the way in which the university functioned. And the women's colleges were early adopters of the model of a college that men like Sidgwick wanted to promote, a college that took responsibility for organising its students' teaching and took on a more expansive sense of a college's pastoral role. And the women's colleges were really important in firmly establishing that idea of what a college should be at the end of the 19th century, an ideal of a college which wasn't really challenged until after the Second World War, when we got the postgraduate colleges and colleges specialising in particular subjects, like Churchill. One of the most fundamental challenges to the idea of what it was to be a college after the Second World War was the idea that colleges could be co-residential, that men and women could live and work alongside one another. And one gets a sense of how unsettling this thought was from some of the weird anxieties that manifested when the colleges considered admitting women. Clare College, for instance, was deeply concerned that women would need softer toilet paper than male students. King's College, when it first admitted women, decided that they needed to purchase a sewing machine and a full-length mirror for its new arrivals. I mock, but Churchill, King's and Clare were the first colleges with undergraduate degrees, but they were only following in the wake of the new postgraduate colleges, Wolfson Darwin and Clare Hall, which were the first to admit female students. But when the men's colleges began admitting women, Girton had a decision to make. Would it become coeducational, or would it remain as a women's college? And that decision was enormously controversial among fellows and students and alumni, many of whom wondered aloud about what the college's founders would make of it all. Well, we know what the college's founder would have made of it, because she explained her position in this extraordinary letter from January 1868, in which she regretted that creating a college for women, I quote, seems to stereotype the idea of separation. Her reason for proceeding with an exclusively female institution was that there wasn't a system of coeducational secondary schools. And she said, you cannot artificially separate boys and girls and then suddenly throw young men and women together at 18. In a startling passage, and it's the one I've enlarged on the presentation here, she wrote, by and by, when the colleges at Cambridge and Oxford are open to women, we will open ours to men. So her passionate commitment to the strictest equality between the sexes had led her to support a coeducational college almost 100 years before that kind of college finally arrived in Cambridge. And with that, I will hand back over to Lucy.
Thanks, Ben. And we're going to just have a quick look now at some of the kind of associational life, what women students got up to in those early days with the women's colleges. And you can see here on this slide, one of my favorite items from the exhibition, which is a tennis dress from Newnham College, which dates to the 1880s. It's lovely to see it there in situ in the exhibition and to remember the days in which we could all be together in such close physical proximity. Alas, now here we all are stuck in our individual spaces. But the tennis dress took pride of place because it so brilliantly captures both the joys of being one of those early female students, the fun that was to be had with rowing and punting and playing tennis and playing golf. Girton had its own golf course, although lawn tennis was the most popular sport, but also the pressure, the enormous pressure on those early students. And the dress it's designed to represent one of Newnham's halls. They all had their own version of a different tennis dress. And we know from the archives that one of the commentators on tennis at Newnham commented that the dress was designed, quote, with a view to the artistic combination of beauty and freedom of movement. It is a beautiful dress. Freedom of movement, though, I don't think it really provided that. You can see that it's got a very, very tight waist. It doesn't have a corset, although a corset might have been, or stays might have been worn underneath it. It's got a slight gathered waist and a bustle at the back, and it's floor length. It's got a high neckline, and it's wrist length, so it covers the body very fully. And that was hugely important for women who were all too aware that they were being very heavily scrutinized when they made that bold and ambitious step into the university environment. Newnham had its own punts, but it only allowed women to punt on the river if they had completed a kind of punting competency course, which was done at 7 a.m. in order to ensure that nobody could see women punting badly. So they were hugely conscious of the decorum needed as a woman student. In the 1920s, the Girton mistress advised Girton students that if they wanted to cycle into town, they could do so without hat and gloves, only as far as Castle Hill. And then they had to stop, get off their bikes, put on hat and gloves, and most of them then left their bikes at Castle Hill and walked into town because it was unseemly to be seen in any other form. So there were a lot of constraints on women in a physical sense. And in this sense, our exhibition took the story of women and sports at Cambridge into the very recent past. So we didn't just stay in the 1880s or the 1920s when there was a lot of constraints on women, but we took it into the late 20th century and the early 21st century, particularly with the story of women's rowing. So Ben, maybe you can move the slide on for me. And you'll see on this slide one of the wonderful things in our exhibition. There we go, a lovely pair of shorts from the interwar period. And those shorts are important because it was the first time that women were rowing without dresses, which were initially had been floor length. It was discovered that it was really hard to row in floor length dresses. So they were shortened to around knee length. And then in the 1920s, women were allowed to wear shorts, but only on the lower part of the river. They had to stop and change back into more seemly wear when they got nearer to the city. And they also still had to wear stockings. And then you can see in the photo on the left a slightly later depiction of a women's boat where Perish thought you can see women's knees without any stockings. But it's a reminder to us when we look at that photo of the lack of resources that was put into women's sports in general and women's rowing in particular. And rowing is, of course, one of the most prestigious sports, most high-profile sports at Cambridge. And it's remarkable that the varsity boat race, the Oxford-Cambridge boat race, did not feature women's teams, women's boats. There were women's varsity boat races, but they were not done on the same day or even on the same course as the male boat race until 2015, when women were finally allowed to row on the Thames course and therefore got access to the national media coverage and the possibilities of sponsorship that allowed for purchase of boats, the building of a women's boat club. And even today, Newnham College still does not have its own boathouse. So there have been real disparities in women's access to the sporting environment, women's physical sense of freedom and fun at university. And I must say that some of the visitors to the exhibition were shocked, some of the younger visitors, at 2015 being the date of the integration of women into the boat race. It's a reminder of how much the battle has continued across the full 20th century and into the 21st century. So Ben is going to tell us a bit more about some of those battles.
Well, as Lucy has said, Cambridge was the first university to pioneer women's higher education, but the last to offer women degrees. And in fact, Cambridge fell behind very, very quickly. The University of London began offering women degrees in 1878, and the new civic universities founded in the late 19th century, places like Birmingham, for instance, offered women degrees from the outset. So by 1914, there were many institutions offering women degrees, and Cambridge and Oxford were the holdouts. Why did Cambridge resist the tide for so long? Victorian ideas about female intellectual or physiological inferiority were dispelled fairly quickly. More important, I think, was a sense that, unlike other universities, Cambridge existed to produce certain kinds of elite masculinity that were best cultivated in exclusively male environments. And also important was a fear that if you gave women degrees, they would claim a say in the running of the university. So when the question first came to a vote in 1897, the proposal was not to give women full degrees, but merely the titles to their degrees. Even so, this was seen as an important landmark, and the debate in 1897 unleashed an unprecedented expression of public opinion, not least among the undergraduates who petitioned the Senate opposing women's demands. And that's the first time the undergraduates had petitioned the Vice-Chancellor since 1771, when they'd opposed giving education to religious dissenters. And so you have to imagine the city being plastered in colourful posters like these. It was a real public debate. No gowns for the Girtonites, Shakespeare being quoted in support of excluding women. Undergraduate opinion was important, but ultimately they didn't have a say in the matter, because the vote in 1897 was for the academic staff of the university and for former students with MAs, because until 1926, former students with MAs were able to vote on matters of university policy. And in 1897, special trains were organised to bring MAs back to Cambridge to vote. You can see a poster here on the right, setting out the timetable of the special trains. These men were anxious to preserve the university as they had known it, and they were a major obstacle for reformers. When degrees for women came to a vote again in 1921, the majority of academic staff supported giving women degrees, but they were outvoted by reformer students. The vote in 1897 turned into a carnival. I mean, you can see it from the numbers thronging the streets in the photograph I began with. And when the result was announced, the students began what was in effect a riot. At the signal, a Keys student crowed like a cockerel. I mean, you can see the Keys student hanging out the windows there. At that signal, the students began pelting the voters with confetti, with eggs, and even with fireworks. And fortunately for us, a passing librarian managed to scoop up some of this detritus and preserved it, so we had it in the exhibition. This is some of the original confetti and some of the original fireworks that were thrown. As the news of the defeat of women's demands spread, a mob formed which marched on Newnham College. And when they got to Newnham, the Newnham staff stood in front of the gates and pleaded with the crowd to turn back, which they did. They returned to the market square and rioted there. They tore the doors and shutters off the shops in Market Square to build an enormous bonfire, which raged until the fire brigade showed up at 3 a.m. Unfortunately, this set a pattern for later violence. When women's degrees was again defeated in 1921, the students repeated this pattern of protest. Again, they marched on Newnham, but this time they wouldn't be turned back, and they vandalised the gates at Newnham College, which are the college's memorial to its founder, Anne Jemima Clough. The following day, representatives from each of the men's college signed a letter regretting the violence of the day before, and you can see that in the photograph on the right. Now, this is sometimes dismissed as merely high spirits, student hijinks, but I think we do have to think about just how frightening and threatening all this violence must have been, and how dispiriting it must have been for women who asked for no more than equality. And in particular, the sense of personal injury felt by students and fellows at Newnham, seeing the memorial to their founder vandalised. This was really no laughing matter, and that violence, I think, conveys something of the strength of feeling that this issue generated in Cambridge, even though universities all over the rest of the country were granting women degrees. I'll move on to the next object we want to talk about, which doesn't look terribly prepossessing in this photograph, but it's a landmark. This is the very first PhD thesis by a woman in Cambridge. This is Catherine Wilson's PhD on music and English poetry, which was awarded a PhD on the 27th of May 1924, only of course it wasn't, because women weren't entitled to degrees, so she didn't get the PhD. What she got was a titular PhD. Women didn't finally get degrees until 1948. The PhD was a recent innovation. Cambridge began offering PhDs only in 1919. So what we see here is a milestone in the creation of a modern academic career. Victorian dons were not academics in the sense that modern observers would recognise. Most college fellowships came with no obligation to teach or to do research. They were prizes for intellectual distinction. They weren't a profession. In the 1850s, most teaching wasn't done by university lecturers. It was done by coaches privately hired by the students. But from the 1860s onwards, the colleges began to try and take control of teaching of these coaches by hiring their own lecturers. And again, Girton and Newnham were among the first colleges to adopt this model of what a college should be like. And the creation of those women's colleges created the very first academic jobs for women in the country. Now, these were largely teaching jobs. There wasn't a big research component in them. So what we see here with this thesis is the growing importance of research in an academic career. Even so, for many men in Cambridge, the traditional path that led from tripos to a college fellowship via a research fellowship didn't require them to study for a PhD. And as late as the 1960s, there was still plenty of academic staff in Cambridge, men who hadn't done a PhD. It was largely women and foreign students who embraced the opportunity of studying for a PhD in the 1920s. I'd like to read you the final paragraph of Wilson's acknowledgements page because the tone, I think, captures something quite important. She wrote, "I have not scrupled to contradict authorities to contradict, and to contradict some of them not very politely. But this doesn't mean that I'm blind to their greatness or disrespectfully disposed towards them. It means usually that I should be afraid if their statements went uncontroverted. Indeed, it may be taken as a general rule that the more often or more rudely I oppose myself to anyone, the more I admire him." And that tone of polite determination and resistance captures something important. After she finished the thesis, Catherine Wilson went on to work as a lecturer in English at a teacher training college, and she published several books based on her thesis. There weren't many academic jobs for women in the country, around about 120 in 1919. In Cambridge, because there were only 2 women's colleges, there were only about 30 academic jobs for women. So the big transformation came when the university began taking teaching back from the colleges by hiring its own lecturers. The university hired its first university lecturers in the 1880s, 28 of them in 1884. By 1962, there were 946 university lecturers. And remarkably, in 1926, under pressure from the government, Cambridge opened these university lectureships to women. So in 1926, 11 women were hired as university lecturers. The remarkable fact is that women were being hired as university lecturers in Cambridge 22 years before Cambridge gave women degrees. Which is one way of making the point that, of course, equality remained a long way off. It's true that women are still underrepresented in academic posts in the university, and sadly there's a gender pay gap which is proving unfortunately very difficult to remove. The exhibition, I think, is a hopeful one because it shows that institutions can change. Indeed, this institution has changed quite dramatically over the last 150 years, and that should be a cause for optimism. But nevertheless, even once women were granted degrees, struggles for equality continued, and Lucy's going to tell us something about those struggles.
Thanks very much, Ben. So yeah, this leads us on to the final item that we wanted to show you. It's a very small badge, a little lapel pin, which was given to us for the exhibition by Jane Tillier, who was appointed the first female chaplain in any Oxbridge college in the 1980s. She had a lay role, so it was before women's ordination, of course, although she went on to later become ordained. And Jane had been given it by Newnham's Professor Lisa Jardine, a very eminent academic, and she dished these badges out to her colleagues, I think to acknowledge and induce resistance to what was often a very hostile environment for women across all the professions, but particularly in higher education. So this invitation to behave badly was a powerful way of suggesting that women should have confidence, should own the space, and should feel that they could belong and could be subversive within these often very conservative institutions that they found themselves. Jane Tillier told me that she loved the badge and she used to wear it under her chaplain's robes while she was officiating in Jesus College Chapel, where she was employed. But she also said, actually, she was too shy to behave badly. She never did. Or in her view, she never behaved badly, although I think merely by her presence in a chapel, some observers of the time would have thought that that was bad behavior enough. And that Behave Badly badge became a kind of centerpiece of our final section of the exhibition, which was looking at the ongoing campaigns around women's liberation, which were very strongly represented in Cambridge City in the 1970s and 80s. And it's a way for us to link into the university and city connections, because women from university contexts and from the town were jointly organizing, jointly producing magazines, staffing the Women's Centre and the refuges that they had founded. And in particular, at the heart of their activism, a number of issues, but the one that I'll talk about today was childcare, which was an issue that was perceived as really making very difficult both the ability for women with children to study, but also in women's academic careers, or indeed in their work for the colleges as porters, as gardeners, as secretaries, and so on. The lack of childcare made it very hard for them to sustain those jobs. So childcare was an essential precursor for mothers to be part of the university in a full sense. And in recognition of this, there was an occupation of Senate House in 1975. It's wonderful how our history sort of circles around Senate House. It's a very important central point, obviously, for the university, but also for the story of women's rights and gender justice at Cambridge. Senate House was occupied by around 1,500 men, women, and children. And for those of you who can imagine the interior of Senate House, you'll know it's not a very big space. And 1,500 must have been as much of a crush as we saw in that picture from the 1897 vote. They occupied Senate House and actually got a response from the Vice Chancellor, a formal written paper within 3 days, saying that yes, he recognized that there was a demand for childcare, but that Cambridge University simply could not afford to meet that demand. So this, within the UK environment, well-resourced, refused to make the money available for childcare until it opened its first nursery in 1993. I should add, though, that the colleges had stepped up to the challenge a little bit earlier and had started opening colleges from the late 1970s. They had started opening nurseries from the late 1970s. So there was a kind of mixed set of provision, but it remained extraordinarily scarce and very expensive. And those of you who've used childcare in the last few years will know that this remains the case today. So that campaign for childcare was at the centre of the ongoing struggles around gender justice, and was, again, a bit like women's rowing, a prolonged campaign that stretched right into the 20th century and into the 21st century. So with that, on that note, I think we'll leave these items. I hope you've enjoyed having a kind of a look at what was in the exhibition, and over to Jessica again for chairing this session.
Hello, everyone, again. I mean, just such a big thank you to Ben and Lucy. I cannot tell you both and also the others on this call what a pleasure it is to hear you speak with that deep knowledge about the items in the exhibition. And for me, not being in my library at the minute, it was such a pleasure to see those artifacts again. So thank you. It also reminds me that I should just say thank you to the curatorial team, and particularly the conservation studio at the University Library, who make all of this possible and really do prepare things for our curators and our historians to do their job. I know that we've got a fantastic number of participants, and I don't think anyone's posted a question yet, so I'm going to ask a couple, if I may, and see if I can encourage others to come forward as well. If not, we'll have a lovely conversation between us and continue the insights. Perhaps I can just start with quite an open question. I mean, I know just how busy both of you are. You're lecturers, you are researchers, you're writers, you have home lives. What is it for you about doing this kind of historical production, an exhibition, that appealed? And what does that add to the telling of history? To either one of you, so do you want to start off, Lucy?
I'll start off. I'll jump in and just say that Ben and I had no idea what we were getting ourselves into when we took up the invitation to mount this exhibition. I certainly learned a huge amount about it. And for me, there was a kind of magical moment where the items that we had selected, we went out to all the archives, we asked the college archivists We looked in the university library archives. There was this magical moment where we put those items together and realized that the physical presence of them and the way in which they were materially housed, lighted, and presented. Some of them were hanging, some of them were on the walls, some of them were on these wonderful little beds and seats. Really changed the meaning of them. It certainly became a much more powerful story. A lot of people who came to the exhibition commented on how moving they found it, how angry they felt at the way women had been treated, how extraordinary they found these pioneering women who fought those battles. And that was a surprise for me. That was a learning lesson, to realize that you could convey something much more vividly in that exhibition format than you could, for example, by writing a book or writing a research paper. I also learned that the team who did that knew how to do it in ways that I had no idea. So when they first set up the lighting and the color scheme and what have you, I was pretty skeptical. There were all these strange colors. But then when it was presented in the actual room, I was completely blown away by it. So that sense of the haptic and the visual sense of the exhibition was really amazing.
Well, because I'm a fellow of Girton, and I do know Emily Davis's name, even though I got it wrong on the PowerPoint, because I'm a fellow of Girton, I was very conscious of the 150th anniversary coming up and quite keen to find ways of communicating that. And what appealed to me about this project was precisely that it integrated the story of the women's colleges into the story of the wider university, because I think too often it's treated as a separate, discrete topic in ways which are quite unreflective about how the university has changed. And I think this was an opportunity to communicate to a much wider audience the history of the institution that they were living and working in or had studied at. One of the great pleasures of working on this project for me has been talking to current undergraduates who came along and didn't realize where their own experience sat in a longer trajectory. And I think there's a temptation to assume that Cambridge has always been like this, that Cambridge's history is one of a fairly slow-moving, monolithic institution with sort of women banging on the door demanding to be let in. And actually, I wanted to convey a sense of the dynamism of that, and yeah, being able to communicate that was the attraction of the project for me.
Thank you so much. And I must say the kind of response of our undergraduate students, both prospective coming to look at the exhibition and thinking actually Cambridge is a place that debates these issues, was really profound and a great outcome of what you achieved. We have now got some fantastic questions coming through. So many, we won't be able to answer them all, but perhaps we can start with this one. Someone has asked, why was Cambridge so much more conservative than Oxford in relation to women's issues? I don't know whether that's one that Ben wants to pick up or...
Former students remained influential in Cambridge's decision-making for longer. It is important. Decision-making power was centralised at the top of the university in Oxford earlier than it was in Cambridge, which meant that Oxford were able to introduce degrees for women as early as 1920. It's also true that the debate in Oxford had established itself a little more securely than in Cambridge before the First World War. There was a sense of momentum before the war, which they were able to carry on once the war ended fairly quickly. I don't know if Lucy wants to add anything.
No, that's good. I mean, I do think that it was actually said in Cambridge, you know, if women want to study, they now have the right to go to Oxford, let them go there. So there was this awful kind of, you know, dismissive attitude to what women could bring to the university. They were thought, of course, to potentially challenge academic standards. Whereas in fact, it turned out that the women's colleges showed that women were bringing up academic standards, because the women's colleges were always at the top of the league for academic achievement. And one of the reasons why the very laggardly colleges like Magdalen, which was the last, decided to incorporate women in the end, was because they realized that their academic standards were challenged by refusing to admit women.
One of the strangest arguments against giving degrees to women, you see it in the Union Society debate in 1897, is the idea that if you let women into Cambridge, male undergraduates will want to go to Oxford instead, that they would be actively discouraged from coming to a university that had that put women on an equal footing with men, that male students would find that really off-putting. I think experience has suggested that that's not the case, but in 1897 that was an argument seriously put forward.
Oh, thank you. It's so fascinating. A question from Elaine. I'm not sure whether will be able to answer this, but I think it might stimulate a couple of comments, and it might need to be our last question, and then I'll wrap up. Elaine asks, how many statues of women might there be in Cambridge, across the Collegiate Cambridge? Not an easy one to answer. Lucy.
Well, I certainly can't say how many statues of women there are. It's a really good question, and I'd love to know the answer myself. I suspect there's a number in colleges of benefactresses, and we did actually feature a very significant 14th century benefactress in our exhibition as paying tribute to the fact that women had often been there at the founding of colleges and in funding college activities. But I will just mention a couple of blue plaques which went up recently. One was for Millicent Fawcett, who I'm ashamed to say had previously been celebrated as a significant figure in Cambridge as a kind of aside on her husband's plaque. And she was only given her own plaque as the most prominent figure in the women's suffrage struggle several years ago. So Millicent Fawcett is there in a blue plaque. And just last year, a plaque went up to Clara Rackham, who was a very significant figure in Cambridge local government and in working in anti-poverty initiatives in Cambridge. So we are starting to recuperate a bit of that past, and maybe we could make a case for more statues and a greater representation of women in that sense.
And do you want to add anything?
No, I have nothing to add to that.
That's lovely. I am really sorry, because we are bang on time and the questions are beginning to really come through now. But I think the faculty would love to keep this as a conversation, so I'll come back to that in a moment. Certainly, I have found this, the Rising Tide exhibition, quite the most vital, dynamic and exciting one that we have had, and I'm absolutely delighted by it. I'm just going to wrap up now with great sadness, actually, to say that we've reached the end of our final webinar in the first webinar series from the Faculty of History at Cambridge. And I'd really like to thank Lucy and Ben for their brilliant presentation. You'll see comments to that effect when you look at the Q&A yourselves. If you'd like to find out more about the Rising Tide, do have a look at the wonderful films that are online. You can search YouTube for Women at Cambridge and those will come up. But also, I believe you will be sent links following this to also get your feedback and encourage you to ask more questions that the faculty can consider. So please do keep this as a conversation. That's what's been so important about the Rising Tide. It has been a conversation. It's about the past, it's about history, it's about activism as well today, and how we shape the future. That's its legacy, and that's thanks to Lucy and to Ben and the many other people who took part. So finally, I'd just like to say on behalf of the Faculty of History that I hope you've enjoyed this session, and indeed others in the webinar series if you've been able to also take part in those. The Faculty of History will be launching its second webinar series because it's been such a successful first series, and that will take place early in the new calendar year in 2021. Until then, I hope you'll stay safe and well. My thanks to Lucy and Ben, and come back and join us for that new series. Thank you.